Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm the manager of programming and external relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is the State of Nonprofits 2023, What Funders Need to Know, and we're so glad that you've joined us. For those of you tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a little bit about us. Our work, of course, is focused on philanthropic effectiveness. For more than 2 decades, we have sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors to improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspective of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We also do this through our Youth Truth initiative, which harnesses student perceptions through surveys and tailored advisory services to help school leaders and education funders accelerate improvements. We are a nonprofit and we rely on grants and contributions to support our research and programs like this one. So please reach out if you're interested in supporting us. Our calendar for opting into our final round of grantee, donor, and staff surveys for this year are filling up. So please feel free to reach out if you work at a foundation and would like to learn more about our assessments. In addition to today's virtual program, we're very excited to be hosting CEP's conference in person for the first time since 2019. CEP 2023 is a 3-day conference for senior foundation leaders, donors, trustees, and program officers, and will take place this fall in Boston from October 30th to November 1st. I encourage you to check out the full program at cep2023.org. And if you're interested in joining us, please go to cep2023.org to register soon, as we do expect to sell out. I want to say a special thank you to Philanthropy New York for co-hosting this webinar with us today. And I'd also like to thank the McKnight Foundation and the Rita Allen Foundation for funding the State of Nonprofits 2023 report, the first of CEP's Nonprofit Voice Project series. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are in webinar format, which means all of you are muted and have your videos off. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we certainly hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel at the bottom of your screen. We will try to be as responsive to as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion. We will not be using the hand raising function on today's webinar, as we're not asking attendees to speak their questions. If you do require technical assistance, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, at saed@cep.org, and he can assist you. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links. If you'd like to enable live captioning, please click the CC closed captioning button also in your Zoom control panel. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I have the privilege of introducing our panelists and speakers for today. First, my colleagues, Christina Im and Katarina Malmgren, will be sharing a brief overview of each report's findings: the State of Nonprofits 2023, What Funders Need to Know, and a not yet released report titled Before and After 2020, How the COVID-19 Pandemic Changed Nonprofit Experiences with Funders. They are 2 of the authors of the respective reports we'll be discussing today. CEP's new Vice President of Research, Alicia Smith-Arriaga, will be moderating today's webinar. We're also joined by 2 fantastic panelists, Shahir Mustafa, President and CEO of Hopewell, a nonprofit social services agency headquartered in Boston that provides a range of critical services to children and families in Massachusetts, and is the largest nonprofit provider of foster care in the state. And Brenda Solorzano, CEO of Headwaters Foundation, a funder focused on the health and well-being of communities in Western Montana. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alicia.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. As Sarah said, we're so glad that you could join us today. Today, we're presenting, and the data that we're going to present today continues the research the CEP has been doing since 2020 that examines the changes in practices at foundations in response to the pandemic. We published a series of reports in 2020 and a follow-up in 2021. These reports detailed how funders were engaging in various changed practices, such as reducing the administrative burden for grantees, providing more unrestricted funding, and engaging in new efforts to advance racial equity. Now, the question for us since then has been to understand the degree to which 2020 was a watershed year for philanthropic practices. Was it the beginning of an enduring change in how foundations and other funders do their work? Or was 2020 a blip in time? So today, we are very excited to share with you some data that sheds light on what we know about the sector today in 2023. We will be hearing, as Sarah mentioned, from both Christina and Katarina, and these are the two reports that we'll be diving deeply into today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christina to walk us through the first report and our approach and what we found.
Thanks, Alicia. So our first report, the recently released State of Nonprofits 2023, is a Nonprofit Voice Project report that explores the state of nonprofit relationships with both foundations and individual donors, how nonprofits are perceiving current challenges, and their recent and projected financial results. So I'll start us off with an overview of our data source. The Nonprofit Voice Project is a project that aims to elevate the nonprofit experience for institutional and individual funders to inform how they give. So, who did we survey to do that? We assembled a nationally representative sample of leaders of US-based nonprofits that receive funding from foundations that give $5 million or more annually. Our plan is to engage this group of CEOs, executive directors, and other leaders over a period of 2 to 3 years. We're very grateful to McKnight Foundation and the Rita Allen Foundation for their support of the Nonprofit Voice Project. So for this particular report, we surveyed the 500 eligible members of our Nonprofit Voice Project sample early this year. We heard from 284 nonprofit leaders who represent a 57% response rate. From these leaders' perspectives, we've gathered 3 key findings, which I'll be taking you through today. Our first key finding is that many nonprofit leaders report an increase in trust from funders and are experiencing changed practices. In addition, most nonprofits report an increase in dollar amounts given by at least some individual donors. So what that looks like is over half of the nonprofit leaders we surveyed report an increase in trust from their funders in the last year. They're also experiencing changes in practice from both foundations and individual donors. On the foundation side, nonprofit leaders cite easier application processes, reduced reporting requirements, and reduced or removed grant restrictions as the top 3 most common changes in foundation practice that they've experienced in the past year. In particular, I want to point your attention to around 3 in 5 leaders reporting that some, most, or all of their foundation funders made application processes easier. Now for individual donors, although we know that overall giving was down in 2022, especially from individual donors, we are nonetheless seeing that some donors stepped up. Approximately 2/3 of leaders are seeing increased monetary contributions. Leaders are also seeing movement on reduced gift restrictions, non-monetary support, and responses to inflation. Across both foundations and individual donors, the majority of nonprofit leaders point to changes in gift and grant characteristics, such as shifts to unrestricted funding or multi-year support, as the most helpful change they saw from their funders in the past year. Now, while nonprofit leaders identify these shifts in funder practices as helpful, they're also experiencing ongoing challenges, and that's where we'll turn to next. Of those, issues related to staff, including burnout, filling staff positions, and retaining staff, are the top challenge facing nonprofit leaders. As one leader explained to us, we have a solid culture and team, but burnout is real. Our challenge is balancing the health and well-being of our team and the organization. Now, more broadly, Almost all of the leaders we surveyed indicate some level of concern about burnout, a resounding 95%. Most notably, over a third of leaders are telling us that burnout is very much a concern, the highest level that you see here on our scale. This concern about burnout is also accompanied by other challenges. 3/4 of leaders had some level of difficulty filling vacancies in the past year, and 1/4 had more staff leave than typical. One leader observed to us that meeting our challenges boils down to one thing: talent. We need leaders who can effectively run their part of the organization in a productive, efficient, and financially stable way. Even in the face of staffing difficulty, leaders have worked to respond to these challenges with creativity and tenacity. And that's reflected here in our third key finding. Despite a challenging economic context characterized by high inflation, most nonprofits experienced either a balanced budget or surplus in the most recently completed fiscal year. And the majority anticipate at least breaking even or having a surplus this fiscal year. So let's break that down a little more specifically. In the most recently completed fiscal year, 77% of nonprofit leaders had either a balanced budget or a surplus. In the current fiscal year, 69% of nonprofit leaders anticipate that they will have a balanced budget or a surplus. So what this amounts to is that across these 2 fiscal years, just 10% of leaders indicate a deficit for both years. When leaders report or project a deficit, they most often cite higher than expected costs as a contributing factor, while leaders who report or project a surplus most often cite higher than expected foundation revenue. So where does this leave us? Across the 3 key findings in our State of Nonprofits report, we see increasing evidence that 2020 sparked real change in philanthropy. But nonprofit leaders are still operating in a deeply uncertain context, and they're seeking support as they navigate continuing challenges. In the future, we at CEP will continue to explore these and other key issues that are facing nonprofit leaders. Thank you, everyone. And now I'll hand it to Katerina to give you all a preview of CEP's next project, which covers some related topics.
Great. Thank you, Christina. I'm going to share a sneak peek at some upcoming research that we plan to release later this month called Before and After 2020, How the COVID-19 Pandemic Changed Nonprofit Experiences with Funders. That relates to this big question we're asking of how funders changed their practices in the last couple of years. And we'll also touch on trends similar to those that Christina described in the first key finding of this State of Nonprofits report. So we undertook this research effort because we were interested in exploring whether the changes that funders reported to us in the wake of the pandemic and their processes and grant types were reflected in our grantee perception report data, or the GPR. For those who may be unfamiliar, the GPR is a survey that funders can use to gather candid comparative feedback from their grantees. CEP has been tracking funder practices through the GPR for 2 decades now, and so we were curious whether we would see any evidence of these shifts reflected in that data. To try and answer that, we compared the feedback for 61 funders whose grantees were surveyed at 2 points in time. At least once before the pandemic between 2012 and 2019, and then again during the pandemic in 2021 or 2022. From this review, there were 2 distinct patterns. First, grantees are spending less time on application and reporting processes than they were before the pandemic, and finding the proposal process to be more helpful in strengthening the efforts funded by the grant. And second, funders are providing slightly more unrestricted support than they were before the pandemic. Now, you may be wondering whether funders who are committed to receiving and acting on grantee feedback through repeated GPRs have generally demonstrated any of these shifts in practice over time, even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the answer would be yes, these trends are consistent with some of what we've seen in the past in terms of funders who have repeated the GPR. However, the difference here is that the magnitude of the change is really larger than we have seen in the past. Funders are simplifying their processes more drastically and increasing the proportion of unrestricted support that they provide more quickly. This finding suggests that the focus on the nonprofit experience in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic has catalyzed a change beyond what we would normally see among foundations who are committed to obtaining and acting on grantee feedback. We look forward to sharing the rest of this report with you all in more detail later this month. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Alicia and the rest of our panel to dig into some of this data.
Thank you, Katarina. I'm excited to welcome our two panelists, Shahir and Brenda, for us to dig into these findings. And, one of the first questions that I have, Shahir and Brenda, is just what are your initial reactions to this data? Did these findings resonate with you both? I would love to hear your thoughts.
So I am really intrigued by these findings for a couple of different reasons. The first is I've been in the field of philanthropy for a long time, and I think I've always wanted to see these kinds of shifts happen. And it's the first time I've seen a study that's reporting nonprofits not only seeing these practices shift among philanthropy, but it seems to be sticking. So making applications easier, providing more general operating support. So I'm curious, what is driving this? Obviously, the pandemic and the unique circumstances that we found ourselves at that time are part of the reason why I think we're seeing some of these shifts. But I'm curious, are they going to stick around? We're a fickle field and we tend to revert back to our traditional practices pretty easily. And then I also know that as a member of the steering committee of the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, the pandemic coincided when the project was launched. And we've seen a huge uptake in this Trust-Based Philanthropy Project and the efforts that we've been doing in trying to partner with regional networks and other PSOs to try to engage foundation leaders in shifting these practices and creating a more trust-based, equal level playing field between nonprofits and foundations. So I think there might be some correlation there as well. In terms of the other findings, I'm really curious about the dichotomy that is presented. On one hand, nonprofits are reporting that they have more resources. On the other hand, they're reporting that they're having significant staff burnout. And so why is that dichotomy existing? And also, how can we help as funders, the nonprofits, think about continuing to build their economic footing so that they can have the resource to address some of the challenges that are being raised by the nonprofits. And so this dichotomy, right, is really interesting to me. And I'm really curious to hear how you have experienced this and what your thoughts are about whether or not this dichotomy is true and how we might think about it in the field of philanthropy.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to just have this conversation. Just really appreciate that. So, just stating the obvious, the pandemic was a massive destabilizer, and I think we can't underscore that enough. And you've probably heard this before, but the Chinese character for crisis is actually two characters combined: danger and opportunity. And I think that's exactly what the pandemic kind of provided. And so within that danger, there was opportunity. And I think we are seeing how that's playing out, like in this context around philanthropy and shifting practices. A racial reckoning that has provided a more sustained focus on equity than any time in the 25 years I've been doing this work. I think there are a critical examination on the sources and methods of wealth accumulation and capitalism in this country that are, was maybe kind of like a underground conversation is becoming much more of a mainstream conversation. And I think that is shifting things. And I think there's a proximity dynamic, and we're seeing that in who is taking up roles within philanthropy. These are more people of color, more people who have done the work in the communities, are taking seats of power in philanthropic organizations. And I think that brings a sensibility and a proximity to the work that is maybe different than the past. So I think those are some of the things that resonate for me. There's this piece around, the budget and organizations flush with resources. And I can speak to kind of, that's not our experience, but we've also shifted how we leverage resources to address burnout. And I think that's part of why we're not flush with resources, because we're actually pointing them towards staff so that we can take care of people. So it's a give and take there. And then the last thing that I just want to say, and this is just my own editorializing here, is that, I think there's, maybe I'm just hopeful and I'm optimistic, that there's a shift away from blaming and shaming around equity conversations, or at least I'm hoping that's happening, because I think the reality is we're all implicated. We can point fingers at philanthropy and how wealth is accumulated, but the reality is we're all implicated. The fact that there's 504 participants on this call right now, that's made possible through cobalt, which is mined in the Congo at $2-3 a day by effectively modern day slaves. So like we can sit here and judge one another for how we accumulate certain things, but I mean, we're all on some level implicated, and I think we need to extend grace to one another. And I see more of that happening, and I hope that continues, because I think that's necessary for us to heal and move forward as a sector.
And as you're talking about that, Shahir, I think the word that was elevated in the presentation was an increase in trust. And I think that is a crucial piece. Oftentimes we talk about trust-based philanthropy, and it very quickly gets down to the practices. And I think it's far more than the practices. It's all those things you name, Shahir, that are required. The building of relationships, transparency, honesty, vulnerability, to be able to work in partnership and try to address all these significant challenges that we face in our world today.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Brenda and Shahir. I mean, one of the things too that also stood out in the findings was this piece around staff burnout and, the finances that we kind of started to touch on a little bit, but it would be great to hear from both of you if there are any innovative things that you've seen funders or nonprofits do around staff burnout and finances as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of take this one to start, and I'll speak to it from the perspective of a nonprofit provider, human services provider. I mean, people are overhead, and this has become kind of I feel like we're shouting this from everywhere, and without people, we can't do this work. And I just think there seems to be a different level of appreciation for that and an understanding for that. So general operating support is absolutely essential. And I'll just give kind of like a brief story from my own experience. So I took over this organization in 2016, and we're about a $25 million shop, about 200 staff, and say 300 foster parents at the time. We did not have an HR department. And, that seems crazy to have an enterprise that large and literally no HR department. The reason why is because we were 99.9% funded through state contracts. And really those contracts don't really allow us to have things like an HR department. So we knew very early on that if we were going to do this work effectively, we really needed to diversify our funding stream. And so at this point, today we're about 83% state contract, 17% philanthropy. So what that blended revenue stream has allowed us to do is to do things like take care of our people. So aside from just the basic blocking and tackling of building an HR team, which we've done, we now have a compensation strategy, for example. So pay matters at the end of the day. I mean, we talk about this all the time at my organization, that this is not volunteer work. This is not charity. We're a human services organization. We're the largest nonprofit provider of foster care in Massachusetts. We provide essential services. We are essential employees. When the pandemic first hit, we didn't get to work remote. My team was in there. I had staff on respirators. I had foster parents die. I mean, this is essential work. So people deserve to be compensated for that work and to be compensated fairly. So we've made a commitment to compensate at or above the 75th percentile. And that's just something that, I hope other organizations can do. And then the other piece is around investment in staff. And so, money matters. We don't do this work for free, but we also need to invest in people. And so one of the things that we've done, and I've seen other organizations do as well, is we call it the WELL, which is ways to engage learning and leadership. So we have a conditionless student loan and tuition assistance program, which contributes $3,000 a year towards somebody's principal student loans. And we don't really discriminate based off of it has to be in a social work related field. I mean, it could be in fine arts. If you're carrying student loan debt and that impacts your capacity to do this work, to do service work or mission driven work, we want to support your ability to do that. You're making a really important choice to serve your community. And we don't want financial burdens to move you away from the field. And so we're seeing kind of philanthropy understand that more and support this idea of overhead and the people that make up the essential workforce of doing this incredibly important work in the community. So that's just a few kind of examples from us. And I'm sure Brenda has many as well.
Yeah, I want to talk about this myth of overhead. I think that there's been this perpetuation idea of that a certain percentage of what it costs to actually operate a nonprofit is somehow overhead. When in reality, everything that everyone does at a nonprofit is related somehow to the program or services that are being offered. But we've created this myth that then guides what requirements or expectations we have of how nonprofits should budget. And because we control the funds, that is what nonprofits end up doing. So one of the things that we've been trying to do at Headwaters is to paradigm shift around that overhead, and have been working with our board specifically to even build our own budget in a way that does not talk about overhead, talks about programmatic related costs, and then there's our grant making. And then we're trying to model this with our grantees and presenting this information to our board, not as here are the programmatic costs and the overhead. Instead, we are saying here is what it costs them to run the program. The other thing that we try to do is really encourage in our conversations with our grantees to really stop and think about what does it really cost to run your program. That includes everything from the CEO's time down to stipends that you might need to offer. And how do you incorporate that into our whole grant? The interesting thing is that a lot of times nonprofits underpay themselves or undermine themselves by building budgets that actually don't cover their true costs. And if we as a field in philanthropy don't push on that, then we're going to continue to undermine the work and the budgetary standpoint of nonprofits. Another thing that I've heard and seen in the field that really addresses the staff burnout issue is an increased attention to either providing general operating support so that they can be deployed in a way to address staff burnout, or specific line items in the budgets that get approved in grant awards that are directed specifically to burnout. Because I think we've seen that in society in general, definitely see it in frontline workers. And something that I think the field is recognizing that doing this work can be traumatic. Doing this work can cause all kinds of mental health, emotional health challenges for people. And if we don't recognize that and we don't put resources towards that, then we are going to continue to see the burnout and lose people who we desperately need in the nonprofit sector.
I mean, along those same lines, as we think about burnout and some of the issues that we've been talking about around finances, I know one of the questions that came in through the Q&A was folks are wondering, Shahira, actually, if you could talk a little bit more about the trade-offs between organizations being cash flush and taking care of nonprofit workers. For example, balancing between building reserves versus salaries and benefits, and how can funders best support their nonprofit grantees?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, I think context matters. So, I was in the very fortunate position that when I took this role, which is my first role ever as a CEO. Prior to that, I was a director of child welfare offices. So I worked for the state. So when I took the role, I knew I wanted to work in an organization that did have some capacity to make investments, strategic investments. And that's a privilege that many nonprofits don't have. So when I took over, we had a bunch of money sitting in IRAs and not IRAs, sorry, CDs. So we ended up creating an investment account. Long story short, we have a pretty significant investment account, which has allowed us to leverage it almost as like a venture capital fund. So I will say that has created a tremendous amount of privilege for us as an organization to do some of these things. However, as a $25 million organization with about a $9 million investment account, that doesn't last very long, right? Like if you're, it's about 3 months operating cash if you just break it down. And our state contracts really don't cover the cost, as Brenda talked about, to actually do the work that we do and the work that's necessary and needed. So when we had this influx of ARPA money and in Massachusetts, where we're based, there was actually so much surplus tax revenue that they had to give $3 billion back to the taxpayers. So that's how much the state was, collected over what they anticipated. So we got these kind of surplus injections of cash. And what most organizations did was bonus their employees, because what they were worried about was the sustainability, right? So they gave, one-time bonuses. And then if another, influx of cash came in, they do another round of bonuses. But we made the strategic decision to actually do salary audits and market corrections. So these were not bonuses. They were actually, we made changes to people's base compensation. And when we did that, we knew that these were short-term injections of money that we were going to have to figure out how to fund that sustainably. I'll be perfectly honest with you. I don't yet have an answer for that. Some of this was knowledge that our contracts are going to be renegotiated, and we anticipate that inflation will be baked into that. So our reimbursement rates will increase, but we still know that's not going to cover 100% of our costs. So it's a combination. It goes back to that idea of a blended revenue stream, which again, for us, we're a bit of an outlier. I mean, the majority of orgs, like contemporary human service orgs, our contemporaries in Massachusetts, are 95 to 99% state contract funded, very minimal philanthropy. So for us to have almost 20% of our revenue coming from philanthropy is really unique. And that does allow us to take care of people. That's just the reality. So we've made that strategic decision. It means that I have to spend my time hustling and fundraising more maybe than some of my peers do. But we believe that the end result is a more cared for workforce who can stay in the work longer, who develops more content expertise, who can ultimately deliver higher quality services to communities that deserve that.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Shahir. I mean, it also, I think what you were sharing aligns with, there's another question in the chat, kind of on the opposite side of that coin for you, Brenda, around what kind of line items does your foundation staff look for in nonprofit grantee budgets when making grants that are intended to address burnout or, deal with some of these more kind of structural issues?
Well, I can tell you that we don't often see the kind of line items that you would want to see that address staff burnout or resilience building or wellness. I usually just see things related to the program and services that are being asked in the project. So the conversation actually comes mostly from our staff and asking our grantees. We recognize that this has been a hard time of transition, of uncertainty, the pandemic, the racial reckoning, the challenging just everything in our world. So what could we do to support you and your resilience building and your wellness? And can we add another $5,000, another $10,000, whatever it is that you need in order to offer services like stipends to all your employees so that they can actually go out and do something for themselves that they would normally not be able to do? Can you bring in a masseuse once a month to be able to offer massages to folks? Can we think about what kind of resources you might need in order to shut down the office for a few days and be able to give people the time that they need? Can you think about creative ways that you might shift some of your holidays or your work hours in order to give people some of the respite that you need. All those things have financial implications, and you have to be able to monetize that and then say, this is what it's going to cost me in my organization, and having those conversations with funders. And, you know, not all funders are going to be the way that Headwaters is in this particular space. So I challenge my colleagues to think about, just like we make pledges around multi-year general operating support, can there be a pledge and a commitment to address the staff burnout that has been elevated by this report?
Yeah, these are all really great points. I mean, it also, there was another question too around this issue of staff burnout. Someone in the chat wants to know what can smaller nonprofits do to prevent and help with staff burnout when salaries and available talent are significant pieces of the solution, and they don't often have a surplus of resources to draw on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge for sure. And again, I recognize kind of the position of privilege that we have as an organization that's somewhat at scale. But I think what it boils down to is, you know, some of these low cost, no cost, they're really culture building practices. And, you know, kind of if you value, you bake in values into your organization around a culture of appreciation, a value, the dignity of work, the importance of self-care and wellness, right? To sustain yourself in this work. Those are values that can be practiced in ways that don't necessarily cost money or cost not a lot of money. And I think that's really, when you can build that into your culture, I think that goes a long way. So, you know, that's basically how I would respond to that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Shahir, that it's a tough situation, but I do think that thinking about how you run your organization and the way that you bring leadership and culture to really elevate the importance of well-being and self-care is part of what we haven't historically done in our society, quite honestly. It's about being on time, overproduction, showing up, always professional. If you're sad, you can't talk about it at work. If you can't show up because you have a mental health issue or challenge, you can't talk about it. If you are in a situation at home that you can't really have a place at work where you can debrief and talk about it and get some emotional support, that's difficult. So we have to really check sort of our white paradigms of what does it mean to be a high functioning culture, and how do we change that in a way that actually prioritizes and elevates well-being and avoids staff burnout.
Brenda, such great and important points just around like the subverting the dominant cultural paradigm and trying to move in a different direction. One of the things that we were just really excited about with this project is really being able to lift up these perspectives of nonprofit leaders across the country. And so one of the things, of course, that we're always thinking about at CEP, and especially now with this conversation and then me coming into this role recently as VP of Research, is we're also just really interested in hearing from you, and others also feel free to put it in the chat. Like, what other issues should we, the CEP research team, be diving deeper into as we continue in our next nonprofit voice project?
I don't know. I wish I had a really good answer to this one. I mean, I'm still stuck on what we're talking about. You know what I mean? To be honest with you, because I feel like, so we won't pivot to the kind of like what we need to do to sustain this, but I think that's really where my head is at, is like, I think I'm hoping this is a movement, not a moment. And so I'm really focused on kind of like building this out. And so I don't know, maybe there's ways to, kind of scaffold a dialogue around how do we create sustainability in these shifts in practice? How do we kind of hold these values in this reorientation that I think is what we've all been talking about? How do we hold that at the center so that we don't get distracted, we don't lose sight, we don't just take for granted that this change will just manifest, but that we got to put the work into it, we got to make it happen. So maybe some toolkits perhaps on like how to actually execute on this, and how do we build this out. I guess that's where my head would go.
Yeah, I think I doubled down on the need to track this over time and see what the trends are. Does it stick? Does it not stick? Why isn't it sticking? Are there particular regions where there's more adherence to this over time or not? Type of foundation or funder. But I also think that exploring a little bit deeper, not just the practices, but the power dynamics and the values and historically the relationships that have existed between nonprofits and philanthropy, I think are more than just practices. They really are connected to culture and values. And so how do you explore that more deeply? What's underlying whether or not we are actually shifting paradigms in the way that we hope create a more equitable society? And I think if you guys can do that and elevate what you're hearing from nonprofits in particular, I think could be really helpful to us.
Well, thanks to you both for that, and to all the great ideas as well that were coming into the chat. And one of the questions too that came up along with this idea of sustainability, and then, we've been talking a lot about staff burnout and finances. And there were a few questions around how are we seeing boards actually, make these same kinds of changes or be open to investing in like some of these staff retention practices, both on the funder side and on the nonprofit side as well?
Well, I'll jump in here maybe with a little pessimism, that I think that there is growing movement among foundation staff. And I think Shahir noted that who is working at foundations has shifted, and that actually is playing out in the way that the field is being pushed to think differently about how we do our work. And I think that there are some leaders and some organizations that are continuing to push. But the biggest obstacle I hear when I go out and talk about our trust-based approach is the challenges of how to bring boards along and how do we shift their thinking. And in many ways, they hold a lot of power. And we, I think, have a lot of responsibility to think about how do we bring trustees into these conversations, into these presentations. Where is the place that trustees go to be exposed to this kind of thinking? I think those are really important things. And until we shift that, I think it's going to be kind of an uphill battle, foundation by foundation, to continue to shift our practices and to stay the course in terms of what this report is saying is happening.
Yeah, I mean, from my own personal experience, this is not a challenge that I face. And, I have an incredibly supportive board, and they really deeply value and appreciate every single person who does the work to make our organization what it is. They really, really get that, and they consistently express that appreciation. So I feel very fortunate, and I don't think that's uncommon, for my peers who lead organizations, that they have that experience as well. I do think, to Brenda's point, like when I talk to folks who are in philanthropy, I do think it's a little different. The composition and the makeup is a little different. And I think, and again, this maybe goes back to the previous question around what CEP can do, what additional storytelling or, can they participate in? I mean, I don't know. Again, I'm just a believer in amplifying bright spots and exceptional exceptions. I think it inspires people. And I think when you can demonstrate, boards that are functioning in this way, or partnerships between nonprofits and foundations that are having like meaningful impact, I just believe in the good nature of people. Like, I think people want to do well. And so when they see that there's a pathway forward, and this is how this partnership led to that, I think it creates openings. So I think the more we can amplify bright spots, and show stories of success, examples, exemplars. I think that's also a way to kind of bring people along.
Yeah, really great points with like how we move boards along with us in this journey. One of the other pieces too that's come up as well from the audience is just this question around, how do we ensure that the kinds of changes we're talking about continue as we anticipate economic downturns? And what are some of the things that we need to think about along those lines?
I think I'm going to build on the bright spot highlights. I think it's going to be important for those of us who have been advocating for these shifts and practices in philanthropy to begin to demonstrate how this matters, why it matters, how it allows nonprofits to focus on mission critical work. And I think that we in Foundation Land like to think about evaluation as sort of what impact did my grant have? And I think there's this fallacy that, I always use this example of I make a $200,000 grant over the next 3 years to a nonprofit and I expect them to end homelessness in our community. And the reality of that is so ridiculous, even as I say it, right? And so how do we shift how we think about, I don't like to use the word evaluation, but learning what's working and what's not working. And I think that if we can capture how nonprofits are experiencing this shift and what it means in terms of them being able to be more effective in the mission critical work that they do, that elevating that and showing that this makes a difference and it actually will help achieve the things that foundations want to be a part of. It will help move needles on social change. I think that will certainly help, I think, the field of philanthropy continue to stay the course on this and maybe even bring folks along that haven't yet joined us on this journey.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that I would say in response to this. I mean, in the human services sector, there's been a lot of conversations around the sustainability moving forward of kind of the existing kind of market. And we're going to see, I anticipate, we're going to see a lot of consolidation. I think we're going to see a lot of mergers here in Massachusetts, just because of the way that the funding streams are. And I worry about what that means for smaller organizations in their capacity to kind of weather economic headwinds. And I'll just say this too, and this may not be the most popular perspective, but I think it's honest. In Massachusetts, I believe there's like over 20,000 nonprofit organizations. And I quite honestly, I do think there is redundancy. And I think there is a capacity, there's an element of like the market kind of speaking on behalf of, who can survive and who can't. So I do think there is some truth to that. I think sometimes there are organizations that maybe just aren't sustainable. And that's just a reality. But I think, that can't be the only way to look at it, obviously. So I think we have to be able to hold both of those things. But that's just some of my observations.
Yeah, super helpful observations, just thinking about like this tension between, real economics, but also like real change that needs to happen. And then along those same lines, there's another question that came in, Brenda, around what are some of the most effective ways to align your values with your practices to ensure that you're staying consistent with your grantees?
Yeah. I often describe how many of us have a set of values that are part of our organizational infrastructure, and they're usually printed in a document or put in a book somewhere or filed in a file cabinet, but we actually don't live our values as organizations. And I'm just as guilty as a lot of other people of having been part of organizations that do that. I think if you are going to really do the alignment, you have to actually build in cultural practices to live your values and to check against whether or not you're living those values every day. I spend a significant amount of my time paying attention to culture at the board level, culture at the staff level, and I see it as a critical, important part of my job. And making sure that everybody around me is actually adhering to those values in a way that comes out in the decisions we make, in the interactions we have, in the relationships we build, and that we're not only doing that internally, but we're pushing that externally in the relationships with our nonprofit partners and other community partners that we work with. I think it's a different way to think about leadership, right? That you are focused on these soft, human, tangible things that are uncomfortable, right? Emotions, feelings, people. That's all more complex. I often say it's easier to command and control kind of culture, but you will not get that values alignment. You will not get to that kind of organizational consistency in really being able to live an equitable culture. And if we're not doing this internally, again, I believe that if you're not doing it within all the organizations, that's never going to flow out to the rest of society. And so we're not going to shift anything or change anything.
These are really, really great points. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time together, but I did want to make sure to close this out. We talked about a lot of changes in philanthropy around, since the pandemic. We've talked about staff burnout, and also finances. And one of the things I think we've kind of continued to circle around is like, how sustainable are these changes that we've started to see that were lifted up in the report? So I'd just love to hear from you both. What is it that we need to do to sustain these changes in philanthropy? And do you have any thoughts about, how we make sure that this is really lasting change, truly lasting change, and not just a blip?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I still hold a worry. I mentioned multiple times, I'm a hopeful person, I'm an optimistic person, but I still hold worry about us reverting back, and this idea of like this pervasiveness of like monitoring and accountability, and like we gotta like capture impact. And I mean, I'm a huge believer in accountability, but I think the devil's in the details, right? And as Brenda touched on, like, how do we think differently about accountability and what accountability looks like? Because the problems that we are trying to solve these are things that have plagued our society like for hundreds of years. We're not going to solve them in a grant cycle, right? And so how do we think differently about accountability? And a mentor of mine said this, and I think it's really kind of sat with me and struck me, and I carry it forward now. And it's this idea that like systems aren't broken. Systems don't need fixing. Systems need healing. And I think that's what Brenda talked about, and that's what I touched on earlier as well. When we think about culture, and that healing work is messy work. It's not simple, it's complex. And I think we have to be able to hold that complexity. And so I think that the more we can do that, the better we are, and the better our communities will be as a result. And so I think that really is dependent on relationship building. And so less of like a transaction between grantee and funder, and more about transformation, partnership, collaboration, mutual learning. And that starts with realistic expectations. And I'll just give a very, very quick example. We launched a program for third grade reading proficiency for kids experiencing foster care, and it's the first of its kind in the country. And it was the R&D behind it was in-kind support from a large foundation. We otherwise would not have been able to do it without their support. Then we got seed funding from an individual donor, essentially like a venture cap injection of money to create a pilot. Since then, we have supported about 45 kids in getting on grade level by third grade through high impact tutoring. And we are now in conversations with securing a sustainable state contract. So I say all that to say that if it wasn't for this idea around seeding innovation, the partnership that I talked about, that trust between a provider like us who's proximate to the work, who's an expert in the field, who gets this work, with a donor who has courage and willingness to make that partnership happen. And then realistic expectations on results. I mean, we're working with Brandeis, the Heller School, to do our external evaluation, and they told us it's going to take 7 to 10 years before you see meaningful impact that you can track to this intervention. And knowing that people are going to have to wait, they're going to have to wait to be able to kind of take credit for these gains. And so that is, to me, the mindset that we need. We need to be thinking long-term at a systems level. We can't be thinking about quick fixes because that's just not enough and not going to get it done.
And I'll try to go quickly because I know we're almost at the end. I think that what Shahir touched upon is shifting from transactional to transformational is really essential in order to keep this going. And in essence, Shahir, you made a case for why trust-based philanthropy should be the norm in the field. Because what at its core trust-based philanthropy is about is around addressing culture, structures, leadership, and practices so that you can actually bend that power dynamic that historically has existed. And if you can do that and do that well, and then elevate those stories so that you can shine the bright light on where it's working and how, I think that that is how you build the ability to continue to have these practices be the norm.
Well, this is great. I'm like, we talked about going from transactional to transformational, really doubling down on trust-based philanthropy. And before I turn it back over to Sarah, this has just been such a, it's been great to hear your thoughts and ideas. And are there any kind of final words you'd like to leave our webinar attendees with?
Thank you. Thank you for your partnership in this work, and thank you for your willingness to push the boundaries.
I think I just have appreciation for all the work that nonprofits do, stepping into the relationship, and really appreciate CEP elevating the voice of nonprofits. I think that we need to do more in collaboration with nonprofits as opposed to doing things to nonprofits.
Well, Brenda and Shahir, thank you so much. This was just really helpful and great to hear your perspectives and your insights. And Sarah, I'm going to hand it back over to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brenda and Shahir, Alicia, Katerina, and Christina. Such a great discussion. And thank you all for so many excellent questions. Really love to see what's on everyone's mind. I just want to remind folks of a few things before we wrap up. We will be, if we haven't already, sending you all a 2-minute post-event survey, and we'd be so grateful if you wouldn't mind filling it out. It just helps us continue to improve all of our programming. I just want to remind folks as well, since there was so much interest, that we will be sending a recording of this event in addition to links to all of the resources that came up in today's conversation and the Q&A. So just want to thank you all for sharing those. And we hope that you will join us at our next webinar. We don't have a date yet, but we'll be sharing that out as soon as we do. And as Katerina mentioned, the other report that has not yet been released will be coming out later this month. So if you want to sign up for our mailing list, you can make sure that we'll let you know when it's out. And thank you all so much. Take care, everyone.